Trying not to cut off my head today, but we'll see what happens with my head. All right, so we're going to start out the book 3, The House on the Rue Plumet. 1. The Secret House. Toward the middle of the last century, a velvet-capped presiding judge of the High Judicial Court of Paris, having a mistress, but on the quiet, for in those days the great lords displayed their mistresses and the bourgeois concealed theirs, had a little house built in the Faubourg Saint-Germain, in the deserted Rue de Plumet, now called Rue Plumet. Now, far from the spot that then went by the name of the Combat des Animaux. This was a detached two-story house. 2 rooms on the ground floor, 2 bedrooms on the second, a kitchen below, a boudoir above, a garret under the roof. The whole fronted by a garden with a large iron gate opening onto the street. This garden covered about an acre. It was all that the passer-by could see, but in the back of the house there was a small yard with a low building at the far end, 2 rooms only, and a cellar, a convenience intended to conceal a child and nurse in case of need. Through a secret door at the rear, this building opened onto a long, narrow passage, paved, winding, open to the sky, artfully concealed between 2 high walls, and as though lost between the enclosures of the gardens and fields, following all the corners and turnings. This corridor came to an end at another door, also concealed, that opened a third of a mile away, almost in another quarter, on the unbuilt end of the Rue de Babylone. Okay, so this is important because it's important to understand that the house is very secluded as far as very private, especially with regard to the gardens. There's the garden at the front. There's also a garden at the back. This is where Jean Valjean lives. Okay, so we're going to skip a couple of paragraphs. So continue on till you skim and look for this scarcely noticeable tenant was Jean Valjean. This scarcely noticeable tenant was Jean Valjean. The young girl was Cosette. The servant was a spinster named Toussaint, whom Jean Valjean had saved from the hospital, a misery who was old, stuttering, and provincial. Excuse me. 3 qualities that had convinced Jean Valjean to take her with him. He hired the house under the name of Monsieur Fauchelevent, gentleman. In what has been related before, the reader was undoubtedly still quicker than Thénardier to recognize Jean Valjean. Why had Jean Valjean left the convent of the Petit Picpus? What had happened? Nothing had happened. As we recall, Jean Valjean was happy in the convent, so happy that his conscience at last began to be troubled. He saw Cosette every day. He felt fatherhood sprouting and growing within him more and more. He cherished this child in his soul. He said to himself that she was his, that nothing could take her from him, that this would last indefinitely, that certainly she would become a nun, since every day she was gently led on toward it, that this way the convent was henceforth her universe as well as his, that he would grow old there and she would grow up there, that she would grow old there and he would die there, that finally, a dazzling hope, no separation was possible. On reflecting on this, he at last began to see difficulties. He questioned himself. He asked himself whether all this happiness was really his own, if it were not made up of the happiness of another, of the happiness of this child, whom he was appropriating and plundering, he, an old man, if this was not a robbery. He said to himself that this child had a right to know what life was before renouncing it, that to cut her off in advance, and in some sense without consulting her, from all pleasures under pretense of saving her from all trials, taking advantage of her ignorance and isolation to give her an artificial vocation, was an outrage to a human creature, and a lie to God. And who knows but, thinking all this over some day, and being a nun reluctantly, Cosette might come to hate him, a final thought which was almost selfish, and less hero than the others, but one he could not bear. He resolved to leave the convent. Remember, Cosette is really his only family, and he's really her only family. And instead of doing what's right for him, which would have protected him, he is doing what he believes is right for Cosette by giving her a choice and not making her a nun in the convent before she has an opportunity to make up her own mind. He made up his mind, recognizing with despair that it had to be done. As for objections, there were none. 5 years between those 4 walls and away from the world had necessarily destroyed or dispersed his causes of concern. He could calmly return to the life outside. He had grown old and everything had changed. Who would recognize him now? And then, to look at the worst, there was no danger except for himself. and he had no right to condemn Cosette to the cloister for the reasons that he had been condemned to prison. Besides, what is danger in the presence of duty? Actually, nothing prevented him from being careful and taking proper precautions. As for Cosette's education, it was almost complete. Once he had reached the decision, he waited for an opportunity, was not slow to arise. Old Fauchelevent died. Jean Valjean requested an audience with the Reverend Prioress and told her that the small inheritance he had received on the death of his brother, which would enable him to live without working, he would leave the service of the convent, take away his daughter, but that since it was not fair that Cosette, not taking her vows, had been educated gratuitously, he humbly begged the Reverend Prioress to allow him to offer the community an indemnity for the 5 years Cosette had passed there, the sum of 5,000 francs. Thus Jean Valjean left the convent of the Perpetual Adoration. On leaving, he took in his own hands, and would not entrust to any assistance, the little box whose key he always had with him. This box puzzled Cosette, because of the smell of embalming that it gave off. Let us say at once that this box never left him again. He always had it in his room. It was the first and sometimes the only thing that he carried away in his changes of residence. Cosette laughed about it and called this little box the Inseparable, saying, "I'm jealous of it." However, Jean Valjean did not appear again in the open city without deep anxiety. He discovered the house on the Rue Plumet, and buried himself in it. He was provided from then on with the name of Ultimus Fauchelevent. At the same time he rented 2 other lodgings in Paris, in order to attract less attention than if he was always stayed in the same neighborhood, to be able to change his lodging, if need be, at the slightest anxiety, and finally, so as never again to find himself in such straits as on the night when he had so miraculously escaped from Javert. These 2 apartments were both very simple and shabby, in 2 neighborhoods far apart from each other, one on the Rue de l'Ouest, and the other in the Rue de l'Homme Armé. From time to time he would go off either to the Rue de l'Homme Armé or the Rue de l'Ouest to spend a month or 6 weeks with Cosette, without taking Toussaint. He was waited on by the porters, and posed as a man of some means from the suburbs, with a pied-à-terre in the city. This man of lofty virtue had 3 addresses in Paris in order to escape from the police. So if you are pulling anything regarding family, regarding love, you might want to go back through and pull quotes, especially on that section. Otherwise, just pull regular quotes.